When the king of late-night television died, there was no funeral, no grand Hollywood service, no lines of black cars, no public place for the world to say goodbye. Yet, in the silence that followed, one name echoed louder than any other. It was the name of a guest no one expected, a ghost from a past he tried to erase. Who was this person? And why did their story haunt the final chapter of Johnny Carson's life? On January 23, 2005, the man who had tucked America into bed for 30 years passed away. Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late night, died quietly at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause was respiratory failure, a result of the emphysema he had been battling. He was 79 years old. His nephew, Jeff Sotz, released a simple, firm statement. He was surrounded by his family, whose loss will be immeasurable. There will be no memorial service. The decision was shocking, but perfectly in character. For a man who lived in the public eye, performing for an audience of millions every night, Johnny Carson was intensely private. His friend and fellow host Dick Cavett once recalled how socially uncomfortable Carson was, how he would strain just to make small talk with a few fans outside the studio. Ed McMahon, his loyal sidekick for 3 decades, famously said, "Johnny was comfortable in front of 20 million people and completely uncomfortable in front of 20. He was often described as the most private public man who ever lived. So in death, he got the privacy he always craved. His body was cremated and the ashes were given to his wife, Alexis Moss. There would be no public gathering, no place for his famous friends and colleagues to share stories. The man whose final show was watched by an incredible 50 million people left this world with only a handful of witnesses. The world mourned in the only ways it could. Tributes poured in from the highest offices. President George W. Bush called him a steady and reassuring presence. Jay Leno, his successor on The Tonight Show, called him the gold standard. And David Letterman, the man Carson himself saw as his true heir, gave perhaps the most moving tribute, saying, "All of us who came after are pretenders. We will not see the likes of him again." Fans left flowers and notes on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and at Johnny Carson Park, across the street from the NBC studios, where he had made magic for so long. But with no funeral, how could there be a guest? And in a life filled with thousands of acquaintances and a few powerful enemies whose name whispered in the aftermath of his death would have truly shocked everyone. The answer lies not with who was present, but with who was absent for so long. The unexpected guest wasn't a person who showed up that day. It was the ghost of a friendship so deep and a betrayal so bitter that it defined the rest of both their lives. It was the story of the one person Johnny Carson could never, ever forgive. To understand the end, you have to go back to the beginning. Before she was a household name, Joan Rivers was a struggling comedian. By the early 1960s, she had been working for years in seedy clubs in New York's Greenwich Village, passing a hat that sometimes didn't even come back. She had slept in her car, worked temp jobs to pay the bills, and even got banned from the Jack Paar version of The Tonight Show after one appearance. She had auditioned for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show 7 times and failed every single time. By 1965, at just 31 years old, many in the industry were telling her that her career was already over. Then came the night of February 17th, 1965. It was a mercy booking, something her manager arranged as a favor, because he also represented Bill Cosby. Rivers walked out onto that stage, convinced it was her last shot. But something incredible happened. She later recalled, "It was one of those nights where everything goes right, the stars are in alignment, and the audience, we just connected. She wasn't just funny, she was electric, and the one person who mattered most saw it." As her set ended and she sat down on the coveted couch next to the host, Johnny Carson leaned in and said the words that would change her life forever. On national television, he told her, "You're going to be a star." Rivers remembered looking behind her, wondering who he could possibly be talking to. She described the on-air chemistry between them as absolutely magical. In that moment, a bond was forged. Carson didn't just give her a break. He became her champion, her mentor. As she would say, for years to come, "He handed me my career." From that night on, Joan Rivers was a regular on The Tonight Show. She made nearly 100 appearances over the next 2 decades. Their on-air banter was legendary. He was the cool, unflappable king, and she was the sharp, hilarious court jester who could make him genuinely laugh until he cried. His belief in her was real. When Rivers launched her own short-lived daytime talk show in 1968, Johnny Carson was her very first celebrity guest, a massive show of support. Her role on the show grew and grew. She began filling in as a substitute host when Carson was on vacation, and by 1983, she was officially named the show's permanent guest host. This was a position of immense trust. When Johnny was away, the keys to the kingdom were hers. She was, in the eyes of the public and the industry, the queen in waiting. Her loyalty to Carson was absolute. She later said that she had received many offers to host her own program over the years, but always turned them down to stay with The Tonight Show. But here is the detail that changes everything. For all their on-air warmth, their relationship was almost wholly professional. It existed under the hot studio lights and in front of the cameras. Rivers herself wrote, "Our friendship existed entirely on camera in front of America. And even then, during the commercial breaks, when the red light went off, we had nothing to say to each other. This wasn't because they disliked each other. It was because of Carson's legendary aloofness. He was a man who built walls around himself. There wasn't a relationship of close friends who confided in each other. It was a professional hierarchy. He was the king, the benefactor who had discovered her and given her a place in his court. And that unspoken power dynamic is the key to understanding the brutal betrayal that was to come. By the mid-1980s, the ground beneath Joan Rivers' feet began to feel unsteady. For years, she had felt secure in her role as Carson's number two. But things started to change. In 1985, Carson signed a new 2-year contract with NBC. Rivers, though, was only offered a 1-year deal. To her, the message was clear. She wrote, "It could only mean one thing. The powers were uncertain about my future." Then came the bigger blow. A memo began circulating at NBC listing the names of comedians being considered as possible permanent replacements for Johnny when he eventually decided to retire. Rivers, who'd logged more hours in that chair than anyone besides Johnny himself, assumed her name would be right at the top of the list. But when she saw it, she was gutted. Her name wasn't on it all. She came to a painful conclusion. NBC would never give the host spot to a woman. She felt her role as guest host was a safe way for the network to use her talent without ever seeing her as a true competitor or successor to the king. It was at this exact moment of vulnerability the new player entered the game. A fledgling network called Fox was preparing to launch, and its executives, including Barry Diller, wanted to make a huge splash. They approached Joan Rivers with an offer that was impossible to ignore. Her own late-night talk show, The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers. The show would air in the exact same time, slot directly opposite The Tonight Show, and the salary was a staggering $10 million, many times what she was making at NBC. Rivers was faced with an agonizing decision. Her loyalty was to Johnny, the man who had made her, but she felt disrespected and discarded by the network he worked for. Her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, gave her some critical advice. He told her not to say a word to Carson until the contract with Fox was signed and finalized. His reasoning was based on cold, hard Hollywood logic. Other comedians who had been regulars on The Tonight Show and left to start competing shows were often immediately banned from appearing on Carson's program. If she told Johnny, and then the Fox deal fell through for some reason, she could be left with nothing. Even worse, they both feared that the famously powerful Carson could make one quiet phone call and kill her deal before it ever happened. So, she kept silent, a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. The weekend before the official announcement, the news leaked. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe, as two completely different versions of the story emerged. According to Joan Rivers, she was horrified that he heard it from someone else. She immediately tried to call him to explain. She said she finally got him on the phone and told him she was leaving to host her own show on Fox. He said nothing. He just hung up. She called back thinking they must have been disconnected. He hung up on her a second time. That was it. They would never speak again. Johnny Carson's version was starkly different. He claimed that phone call never happened. He told people that he learned about her new show from a press release, just like the rest of the world. He felt completely blindsided, ambushed, and betrayed by the person he had championed for over 20 years. Why was his reaction so extreme? Other male comedians had left to do their own shows, and while there might have been tension, Carson had often given them his blessing. Rivers had her own theory, one that cut much deeper than simple professional competition. She later wrote, "I think he really felt because I was a woman that I just was his that I wouldn't leave him. I think it was a question of I found you and you're my property. He didn't like that as a woman. I went up against him." In Carson's world, a man leaving to compete was ambition. A woman leaving was treason. The king had been defied and his wrath would be swift and devastating. Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in television, used his influence to punish her in every way he could. The first and most obvious consequence was that she was immediately and permanently banned from The Tonight Show. For the rest of Carson's tenure, and even for years after he retired, she was not welcome in the studio that had been her second home. But it went much further than that. Carson created what was essentially a blacklist. Anyone who appeared as a guest on The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was told they would no longer